Hi, I'm Finn Steelfur, and this is Steelfur Speaks. You know, I haven't been playing much Fab recently. I've been doing a lot of this. I've been painting cute things. I've been bonking people with my giant hammers. Doing a load of, like, you know, really enjoyable Final Fantasy gameplay. Look, it's a starry sky. This is a new class, Pictomancer. It makes things and then makes them come into reality, and that's really fun. But we're not here to talk about Final Fantasy, are we? We are here to talk about FABTCG, the best TCG on the market. What's been going on? So, before we talk about cards, can I just rant about the UK elections for a moment? So, for those of you not from the UK, you can skip ahead by like 5 minutes and you'll get the Fab content. But bear with me and assume that you know you don't know anything about the UK elections. So the UK elections are happening tomorrow. We're all voting in the UK elections tomorrow. It looks like the Labour Party's going to win. Are they going to have the money or the policies to actually do any of the things that need to happen? That's a really big question mark, but they might do one or two nice things, and they're better than the people who've been in power for 14 years. You know, but there's some... I just want to pin something to a wall here, right? Is that... Because this is happening... I mean, for my UK audience, I guess you'll be interested in this because you might be voting tomorrow. But the American audience should probably be interested in this as well. Is that... You know, there's this massive cost of living crisis that's striking the UK. And it's partly caused by COVID. But if you... Because we're still paying for it, right? But it's also just caused by... Well... In some ways, it's still caused by COVID, but it's also caused by a massive sort of uptick in wealth flowing upwards and up the pyramid into the hands of super rich people. And that's not people who own, you know, 2 houses and have £1 million, or even people who have 3 or 4 million pounds. It's, you know, people with 100, 200 million, 300 million pounds who every time they get an X amount of dividend payment can go and buy more property or land or assets, and then those assets are rented or you know, sold via mortgage to people who then take on more debt and, you know, are trapped in a cycle where living standards are falling because you're paying more for rent, more for mortgages, etc. And just to capture this for a moment, because I find it very interesting, it's what I was reading immediately before this podcast. So if you look at the UK census, which was conducted in 2021, so our last census, you'll see that we had roughly, I think it's 65% of people owning their own accommodation, 37% renting their accommodation, with 0.01%, so only 33,000 people living completely rent-free. People do not have enough bedrooms. 4% don't have enough bedrooms, but that's fine. Most people have central heating. That's okay. Most people have a car. So, but that statistic is quite interesting because if you fast forward to, say, Avant Homes, a big company, they do their own survey. 50% of UK adults own their own homes. But when you dig a bit deeper, you see 28% of people own their own homes outright. 22% have a mortgage. If you have a mortgage, depending on the size of it, you don't own your own home. You've borrowed and accumulated debt to own a house, right? And that is a big difference, to eventually own a house. It's not exactly the same thing as owning your own home, because basically someone has, by giving you money, allowed you to purchase a house. But the fact is that the house price is also higher because the mortgage is what keeps the house prices higher, right? If no one can get mortgages, house prices fall. When debt has been very expensive recently, house prices have come down because people haven't been able to get mortgages, right? Mortgages, in essence, prop house prices up. And mortgages are also an instrument for very rich people who have money in the large banks to basically generate more wealth off static assets. So that's happening. You also have the fact that during COVID, when a lot of people couldn't pay their mortgages, they had to sell their homes. A lot of those homes were bought up by people who were essentially acquiring them as rental properties and for assets. And there are loopholes in the British legal system and the British tax system that give you tax breaks if you buy large amounts of residential property in bulk, but don't give you the same tax breaks if you, say, buy a second home to rent out, or if you have 3 houses to rent out. Basically allowing rich people. So we're in a bit of a pickle here in the UK, and that's what I really want you to take away from this politics minute as I rant at you before we talk about Flesh and Blood and how Zen is actually not the demon that we were all led to believe that he would be. Is that the wealth is flowing ever upwards. The rich have realized that they can leverage their large amounts of capital wealth to acquire the very assets that the middle class rely on for stability and financial stability. And we are on the border of very much a continuing crisis. We've been in that crisis for the last few years. It accelerated rapidly during COVID. And what that looks like is very, very simple. It's a rapid increase in the amount of homes, residential homes and houses that are owned by banks or by private equity and rented instead of being sold. It's an increase in property prices above what is affordable because it's cheaper it's more practical for a bank to pay 50,000-60,000 pounds more than a residential purchaser to buy a house if they know that they can keep it and the land for 20, 30, 40, 50 years and get rental income on that property, and then flip it when that rental income doesn't make sense anymore and still make a good profit. Housing has become an asset that people are investing in, especially the super rich, and that is forcing a rapid increase in their wealth and a rapid decrease in the spending power of the middle class. Not to mention the lower class, right? Lower class, middle class. These are slightly outdated terms, but if we talk about the lower economic bracket, they're obviously squeezed by this because rents are going up. But rents are going up for them because middle class people are now having to rent and are choosing to rent the nicer places and spend a bit more to get a nicer thing. But we're in this entire falling cost of living crisis that basically is causing a lot of problems for people in the world. And in the background of that, I choose to play a trading card game, which costs me a large amount of money every year. But you know, that was I will be honest with you guys, because one of the reasons that this is on my mind is, you know, as I begin to plan for the future and have sort of serious conversations with my girlfriend, you know, do we want a child in the next 2 years or 3 years? Potentially, yes. As I start to think about where am I going to raise that child, where am I going to send that child to school, I've started to think more about owning a house. And when you think about the role of a luxury hobby like Fab in your life, then you have to say, okay, you know, where does that spending come in? And also, in the face of that, if this nebulous thing out there, well, it's not even that nebulous, right? We can just put a flag in it and say you can see a large seizing of, we'll call them critical assets like housing, by, you know, as an investment asset. It's one of the things that led to the 2008 crash. You can see that happening in real time. And as the middle class becomes more squeezed, the number of people who can't afford luxury hobbies like trading card games actually might drastically start to fall, right? Whatever you have to say about it, something like Fab is a luxury hobby. And I have a feeling that all of these things coming together are going to lead to a lot of people in the next sort of 3 to 5 to 10 years saying, actually, trading card games are too expensive and I can't do that anymore. And they're going to be spending money on food and their families and housing. And that's a sad thing because, of course, these things bring us joy. So to tie that all together and end my election segment, which snuck in randomly just because I'm someone who loves to talk about these kind of things, the new government's going to come in. The Labour Party, you know, is also full of rich people who don't want to tax themselves. We have this weird thing called first past the post voting in the UK, which is a bit outdated, but basically you have one vote and whoever gets the most votes gets in, even if they don't get the majority. Whereas a much better system is where you can vote for more than one person, and if your first preference doesn't get in, then your vote goes to your second preference, etc. It's really, really hard in the UK to vote for anyone that isn't the top 2 political parties, because basically if you don't like one of the parties, you have to vote for the other one or they don't get in. And we end up in this kind of stagnating system where both, there are upsides to it, but generally stagnation, where both parties are basically stuck somewhere in the centre left or centre right. And neither of the, like, they're both kind of accumulating wealth for themselves in different ways. And there's been huge examples of corruption in the Conservative Party in the last 13 years. I'm sure Labour also has corruption in it. And all I really want is sensible economic policies for money to not flow consistently upwards, because, you know, in a free market economy, it is very possible that the super rich will use their assets to generate more wealth at the expense of the middle class and the lower classes. And I think that things like housing should become more of a protected asset class that people can't just acquire en masse, and is somewhat protected in terms of, it's not an investment tool. It is a thing that people can aspire to own for the safety and security of it. Or start controlling rents and say, hey, you bank, you can own as much property as you want, but we're setting a market rent price that you're going to have to match, and you can't go outside these bands, and see if they're super keen to own property when they can't just keep pushing rents up and up. But something is going to give. But we're voting for a new political party, and the Labour Party is going to win immensely because we're fed up with the other guys. Will we see massive change? Who knows? Where have we seen change, however? Nice segue after 10 minutes of ranting about politics. But I know some of you like it when I go off on a rant, because you rarely see me talk about something that isn't fab. So I know I've heard feedback that, like, hey Finbar, when you rant about something that isn't fab, or you talk about cooking, that's actually kind of enjoyable. So I do give myself a bit of freedom to sometimes rant about crazy things. I've heard interesting solutions, by the way. Someone suggested that all you have to do is tax 1% of the income of people who make more than £10 million in the UK. There's this argument that if you tax rich people, they'll leave. But there's also a large swathe of rich people who have, more than £10 million, but, not super mobile, because only really the super hyper rich are actually massively mobile. The rest of the people own property that they rent out. They own farmland, they own businesses, they own all these things that actually make their wealth kind of landlocked, or they're in businesses that are heavily consumer focused, and those businesses are incredibly dependent on their revenue on the consumers, who are also similarly landlocked. So if you're actually taxing a company who has either all of their customers are, mid to low income and therefore not mobile, and will have to keep buying from that company within the company, or buy from a competitor, i.e. if someone was taxing milk sales, people still have to buy milk, right? So, or you have all these other people who just own property. If your income, and you're worth over 10 million, and your income comes from owning 200 properties that you rent in the UK, you can't just liquidate those properties. That is your business, your livelihood. But if you paid 1% more tax, you wouldn't feel it. The government would feel it quite a lot. So there's lots of interesting ideas floating around. Back to Fab. Let's talk about Fab for 10 minutes, or I'm going to get kicked off of my Fab content creator bundle. The National Championships Week 2 happened. And guess what? Zen, while still being a candidate for really good deck, didn't win the most. So that's a question. Now. Right? Now. Okay? This is, in my mind, an entirely deliberate meta that we've landed on. You find the power of Zen, you counter it with Nu, and then you have the Guardians coming in from the side, right? So we've got an idea of what Brian Gottlieb's favorite hero in the set is Nu. Therefore, obviously, we want a set where Nu is viable. We want Mist to come in and have a huge impact on the meta. So maybe we let Zen be kind of too powerful, maybe a little bit too powerful, so that there's room for his hard counter to come through. Because Nu is also a very strong deck, by the way. Not strong uniformly into everyone, but it is a very strong deck. Which is kind of interesting. So we kind of see this setup where Zen is set up as the aggro week 1 meta. It's very common in new metas that the aggro deck takes week 1, and then once people learn how to counter the aggro deck, we see the control deck come around. I'm still loving Zen. I have my Traverse the Universe here. I will also play Nu when it comes out. Not when it comes out, but when I get the cards for it, and when I think it's good. But I am a bit interested. So I like how much of a meta impact Mist has come in with, and with Nu and Zen being both very strong decks, I am concerned. And I think the concern is in terms of, like, someone said this to me at my nationals. I think it's a very interesting point. He said, is Zen the problem, or is the, like, 5 tier 2 decks that Zen shuts down the problem? Now, they gave an example which I don't know how strong the deck is. I've never played it, but it's just the idea that you're going to play Talishar and Olympia, and you're going to wager an attack for 7 every turn, and then when your Talishar breaks, you're just going to buy a new one. And they were like, well, that's a really fun deck idea that I can't play because Zen is very good, and I think that's a really fun deck idea that you can't play because it's not very good. But there may be other decks out there, I think, that match that criteria. You know, there's KO, who we've not seen as much of. There's Dash.io. There are a lot of interesting aggro-ish decks out there that are not doing well into Zen, and therefore not making it onto the list of nationals. And I do wonder that when you have, because we had it a bit with KO, right? And it is kind of the reality of card games. When the new aggro hotness comes out, the best aggro deck is the one that aggro players play, right? So KO was the best aggro deck, so people played him. Zen is the best aggro deck, so people play him. And it's hard to create balance unless the decks are very close together that says, hey, play me even though I'm not the best numbers, right? There's other stuff like Victor, which is like, he's not aggro, but he has aggro builds and he can do stuff like that. But overall, like, that's kind of what we're seeing is this best aggro deck comes in, counter comes in, and I can't decide if I like it or not. And by that I mean, like, if we had this happen every single set, so new set comes out, a new set comes out, it has 3 heroes in, 2 of those heroes are meta viable, and then 2 of those heroes are soon the best heroes in the format, and then there's a smattering of other good A-tier heroes that compete around them, and every so often you get a breakout come in. On the one hand, that's great, right? New set comes out, meta impact, freshness, but there are some questions as to how much power creep that's introducing into the game. When the new set comes out, is that always going to be a power creep over the previous set? Or does it invalidate the previous decks, but then allow other decks in the past to come back in and kind of freshen up the format? That's like the ideal, right? Is new decks come in, they're powerful, so people want to play them, and then they awaken, you know, Dash, Inventor Extraordinaire, or Katsu from the annals of the past, and they come in and suddenly they're good. Right? That's kind of like our ideal. Our other, you know, the other ideal, which is this, where it's like this set, the previous set, Dash is kind of a weird, like, she hasn't Living Legend yet, but she will soon, kind of like legacy hero, and Prism is, you know, older. But the fact is that of the main wins, the last 2 sets are the main majority for the wins. And kind of what I'm doing is positing the question that if that's going to be your model, should you just have rotation in the game, right? If the 4 sets you release in a year are supposed to be the best, you know, the new heroes that are going to impact the meta, is it better to have more power creep so they can impact the meta, or is it better to have rotation so you need less power creep in order to get those heroes to have an impact? Or will you be happy kind of if those heroes are on the level of meta impact of, say, Bright Lights versus what we've seen with Mist, right? Because we could have 2 Bright Lights a year where they're interesting but they're not super powerful, or we could have 4 Mists a year. And I think if we had 4 Mists a year where the heroes are playable, they're powerful, it would be fun, but it would create this kind of churn, it would create power creep, and I think it would almost create a little bit more fatigue than it has been previously. And okay, I've always advised, you know, Fab is that game where you can pick a class, pick 2 classes, and skip sets if they don't have anything relevant for you. You know, one of the videos on my channel I now do after every set is just, if you aren't playing the heroes in the set, these are the generic cards you need to buy. And it's a very simple 5-minute video that just says, what generic cards are super interesting, what is actually worth you buying, and it recommends buying things like Stonewall Gauntlet when it was £25 and now it's £70. So those videos are useful for people who don't want to invest. And I think if you're not playing Wizard or Runeblade, the next set is also a great time for you to just be like, hey guys, I'm going to keep my money on this one. But then, of course, we have that issue. Whereas if the next set has the same level of meta impact as Mist, are you basically ruining your meta chances for the year or for the season by not buying into it? Now, let's be realistic. If you are a super competitive player, it is not unreasonable to think that you are going to be able to build a deck or borrow the cards to build a deck out of any hero from any set. But up until now, Fab has been at least mostly rewarding investment in specialization in certain heroes. And what that means is that your Dash players can still be relevant year after year and aren't immediately taken over by the new set. What is alarming about Heavy to an extent, because Victor is still good and KO is still good, and also Mistveil, is that the impact seems to be larger than previous sets we've seen, which is both super fun, but also a kind of change in the feeling of what is still viable, right? And I think that's just something I want to draw attention to. I don't think there's really an answer there. And I think if we look at week 1, we saw a much broader split. But then New has been really refined in the last 2 weeks. So I think she's gotten a lot better. So this is what I'm happy with, right? And if there was one less Zen win, it would be perfect. This is what I think is peak Fab. And this is the Fab that has me worried, if that makes sense. I enjoy the fact that there's heroes on this list who are popping up, Dorinthia, WTR, Arcane Rising, Bright Lights, and then I see this one and I say, okay, but this is Mistveil, heavy hitters, and then one win by these, which isn't particularly interesting, right? So, is this power level something we can get used to? Is it something that's going to get power crept? I will say, I have a video that I put out last week, which I've titled like the advent of Fab 3.0, and I really would recommend you watch that. It's a real deep dive into the points that I think indicate that we've really entered into the golden age of Fab, in a sense that I feel like design is getting better. They're designing for complexity, but accessibility is staying good. Obviously, they've cracked the Marvels with all the full art stuff they're doing. There's loads of other points in that video. I do recommend going and watching it. But this is kind of, if we have Fab 3.0, and if we really have turned a corner, then Victor and KO become our anchors, right? Because heavy hitters is our anchor. And if that's our anchor, then the power level that immediately follows with Mist is just sticking and matching the anchor. And it will mean for a while that the older heroes kind of get power crept. But the real question is, can we successfully stay at a level where Zen and Nu are the power level, or are we going to see them power crept in the next set? So I think that's the question I'd like to leave you guys on this week. How would you feel if Rosetta was power creep? Do you think the heroes from Rosetta need to, like, for instance, if Nationals happened a month after Rosetta came out, would you need it to be Verdance and Florian up here along with Zen and Nu? Are you happy if a set comes out and it doesn't have as large a meta impact? Or would you like every set to be like Mist, even though you have to spend a lot of more money per year in order to keep up with those meta relevant sets, as the latest set is going to be the good set? So those are some questions just for people to answer in the comments. I've been getting some really interesting replies from people in the comments about what their thoughts are. There were a lot of thoughts as well on my set tier list that I put out. Sorry or thank you for listening again to my political rant at the start. I don't know. Elections are super important and people should vote. And I really couldn't help talking about them this week because that is really what is on my mind. If it really turns you off, you can yell at me in the comments. Otherwise, I don't really give a damn. I know for a fact that my standards of living have dropped in the last 7 or 8 years. And, that is just a reality. and I have had to consider how that would affect my life and what hobbies I would keep and not keep because of it, and sell board games that I didn't play anymore, and all these other kind of decisions. So there we go. That's an episode. As always, thank you for listening. Please do like and subscribe. Most of you are still not subscribed. Please do share on social. Please do yell at me if you find something you don't like. I tend to respond. And, have a good one. And if you've got your national championship still coming up, good luck. And I will see you soon.